They called it an ice house. Winter called it survival.
The hand that pressed against that stone wall did not belong to a young man looking for shelter. It belonged to Sanford Holloway, 52 years old, the most respected carpenter in Elkhorn Basin. A man who had spent 3 decades telling others exactly how a building should be built and why. His fingers were stiff from the cold. The temperature outside had dropped to 36 below zero, and the wind was still moving. He had pressed that hand against the southern wall of Ransom Thatcher's stone house in the middle of the worst blizzard anyone in the valley could remember, and he had not pulled it back. That moment was still 8 months away when this story began. In the summer of 1884, Elkhorn Basin was running a race that every settler understood without being told. The first heavy snow would seal the mountain trails sometime in late autumn. After that, what you had was what you would survive on. Every family in the valley knew the arithmetic. You needed walls. You needed a roof. You needed enough firewood stacked to carry you through to March. And you needed all of it finished before the cold made finishing impossible. The sound of that summer was the sound of axes. Crosscut saws working through pine. Trees crashing down the hillsides. Fresh timber stacked in rows beside rising cabin walls. From one end of the basin to the other, men were building as fast as their hands would allow. And the speed of the work told you everything about what winter meant in this part of Wyoming. On a low rise above Window Creek, a man named Ransom Thatcher was doing something nobody else in the valley was doing. He was not cutting trees. He was not hauling lumber from Corbett Farnsworth at the sawmill. He was clearing sagebrush from around the crumbling stone walls of an abandoned frontier fort. And he was mixing mortar. The fort had been empty for years. Its walls were low and weathered. The old stones darkened with moss. In places, the mortar between them long since turned to powder. Most settlers who rode past it saw a pile of useless rock. A few had suggested tearing it down for paving material. One man had mentioned it might make a decent livestock pen if you added some fencing. Nobody had suggested living in it. Ransom Thatcher had used his family's savings to buy the deed to that land. He was 44 years old, broad across the shoulders with hands that showed the evidence of work done with stone and lime over many years. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their time outdoors, without giving much thought to shelter from the sun. He did not talk a great deal, and when he did, he chose his words carefully enough that the people around him sometimes waited a beat or two before answering, uncertain whether he was finished. His wife, Cordelia, was 40 years old, and had the kind of stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for passivity until they had known her long enough to understand it was something else entirely. She observed things carefully and said what she meant when she said anything at all. Their son Jasper was 14 at the age where the opinions of other boys his age had begun to matter more than he wanted to admit. Their daughter Hesta was 10 and had not yet learned to soften her questions before asking them. And there was Loam, a brown and white hound of no particular breed distinction, who had been with the family long enough to have developed opinions of his own about where to sleep. In those early weeks of summer, Loam did something that Ransom noticed and did not mention to anyone. The dog refused to rest in the shade of the sagebrush or beneath the scattered cottonwood trees near the creek. Instead, he kept returning to the southern wall of the old fort. the long face of stone that caught the afternoon sun and held it longest as the day moved west. He would circle twice lower himself to the ground with the careful economy of an animal that had learned to conserve effort and lie there with his chin on his paws. Ransom watched this happen 3 times in a single week without calling the dog away. One afternoon, Jasper came to stand beside his father and looked at Loam stretched out against the warm stone. He asked why his father never moved the dog to the shade. Ransom did not answer immediately. He looked at the dog, then at the wall, then at something further away that Jasper could not see. He picked up his trowel and went back to work without answering at all. Jasper stood there a moment longer, then went to help his mother carry water from the creek. The question stayed with him without resolution, and that was precisely where Ransom intended to leave it. The reason Ransom Thatcher trusted stone the way most men trusted timber went back 15 years to a different kind of work in a different part of the country. Before he brought his family to Elkhorn Basin, he had spent the better part of his working life building retaining walls and lime kilns in the dry foothills south of the basin country. It was slow, precise work that most men found tedious. Ransom had found it instructive. A lime kiln ran for days at a time, the fire inside reaching temperatures that would have destroyed any wooden structure. The stone walls of the kiln absorbed that heat over hours, day after day, the way dry ground absorbs rain, taking it in, gradually holding it deep in the material itself. And then, one morning arriving before sunrise to restart a burn, Ransom had pressed his palm flat against the outer wall of a kiln that had been cold since the evening before. The fire was out. The coals were ash. But the stone was not cold. Somewhere deep in the mass of it, the heat from yesterday's fire was still present, leaving slowly in no hurry, as if it had nowhere else to be. He stood there in the pre-dawn darkness with his hand on that wall for a long time. Around him the foothills were cold and the stars were still visible, and the air had the sharp quality of early morning before the sun changes anything. The stone under his hand told a different story. It told him that heat given enough time and the right material did not disappear the moment its source was removed. It moved into stone the way water moves into earth, and it stayed there until something drew it back out. He had watched it in other places after that. Stone walls facing west that remained warm to the touch well after sunset. The packed earth floor of an old cellar that held a temperature noticeably above the air temperature even in January. A brick hearth that radiated gentle warmth hours after the last fire had died. Most people walk past these things without stopping. Ransom stopped every time. The question he had been carrying since that morning beside the lime kiln was a simple one. If stone could hold heat that way, if it could store what a fire gave it, and release that stored warmth slowly and steadily through the night, then what would happen if you built an entire house from it? Not a house with a stone foundation and wooden walls, the way most sensible builders did it, but a house where the walls themselves were the thermal memory of every fire you had ever lit inside them. He had never had the chance to test that question until the day he rode past the crumbling fort above Windell Creek. The winter before had given him reasons to test it that he did not want to have. His family had spent that season in a hurriedly built wooden cabin, like the one most settlers in the valley occupied. In calm weather, it was adequate. In January, it was a different kind of structure entirely. The wind found the gaps between the boards as if it had been looking for them. Cordelia spent long afternoons pushing cloth scraps and dry grass into every crack she could identify, and within a few days she would start again because the cold always found new paths. Jasper slept in his coat. Hester woke one morning with frost caught in her hair near the edge of the blanket and said nothing about it, which was somehow worse than if she had complained. The iron stove worked without rest, and Ransom fed it late into the nights until the metal itself groaned from the heat. The warmth that resulted was real, but it did not travel. The center of the room held it. 3 feet away, winter was still fully present. A wooden bucket set near the far wall carried a skin of ice before dawn on the coldest mornings, despite the fire that had been burning since before supper. What stayed with Ransom through all of it was not the cold itself. Cold was a fact of the frontier, and he had made his peace with facts. What stayed with him was Cordelia's silence. She did not blame him. She did not ask why the cabin was not warmer, or whether he had built it right. She simply continued doing what needed to be done, pulling the extra blanket from the chest, repositioning the children closer to the stove, banking the fire before she allowed herself to sleep. Her patience with the inadequacy of the situation left a mark on him that no amount of complaint could have matched. Watching her endure it without accusation made him feel the weight of the failure more precisely than any anger could have. Somewhere in those long, cold nights, he reached a conclusion he had been moving toward for 15 years. The problem was not the amount of firewood. The problem was the building itself. A thin wooden wall had no capacity to hold warmth. It let heat pass through it in both directions with equal ease. When the fire burned, some of that heat entered the wood and passed straight out into the night. When the fire faded, what little warmth remained in the room followed it into the darkness within the hour. A wooden house lived moment to moment. It had no memory of yesterday's fire and no way to borrow against it. The answer, if there was one, had to come from a different kind of material entirely. When spring finally opened the trails, Ransom did not go to the sawmill. He rode out looking for stone. The old fort had not been difficult to find. It sat on a slight rise above the creek. Visible from the road, its walls low enough that a man on horseback could see over them. The parcel came with 40 acres of mediocre grazing land and no improvements worth mentioning. The price reflected that. Ransom paid it from the family savings without telling Cordelia what the figure was until after the deed had changed hands, which was a conversation he would not forget and did not intend to repeat. The walls of the fort measured roughly 24 feet to 38. They were built from local stone, dense gray rock, quarried from the hillside above the creek, and whoever had laid them originally had known what they were doing. The courses were well fitted. Even with the mortar long gone from the joints and years of frost and thaw, working at the structure, the walls were still standing. Newer wooden buildings had been built and abandoned in the basin during the same period. The stone had outlasted all of them. Ransom spent his first week simply clearing and assessing. He pulled loose stones from the upper courses, exposed the foundation on all 4 sides, and worked through each section, methodically, determining what could be reused, what needed to be reset, and where the damage required rebuilding from the ground up. The northern wall had suffered the most, Freeze and thaw cycles over many years had opened gaps between stones in several places, and the original drainage around the base had long since been blocked by accumulated soil and debris. He worked alone most of the time. Cordelia brought water from the creek, and Hesta helped carry smaller stones. Jasper was assigned the task of collecting dry grass for the mortar mix, which he performed with the resigned efficiency of a boy old enough to understand that the work was necessary and young enough to wish it were someone else's job. The mortar Ransom mixed was not the simple lime and sand formula most builders used. He combined lime with local clay and crushed shale for density, then added dry buffalo grass fibers to hold the mixture together while it cured. The result was a mortar that bonded well to the existing stone and hardened to a finish slightly tougher than the standard mix. He pressed it into the joints, carefully smoothing each one flush with the stone surface on the exterior side. The work looked like nothing from a distance. Neighbors riding past on the main trail could see a man moving stones and spreading mortar. The same motions repeated hour after hour, day after day, with no dramatic progress visible. Walls that were low in the morning were equally low in the afternoon. The difference, invisible from the road, was in the quality of the joints. The remarks started early. One afternoon in late July, 3 men stopped their horses on the trail above the old fort and watched Ransom work for a while before anyone spoke. Sanford Holloway was the first to arrive at a conclusion, which was his habit. He was 52 years old and had been building in the basin for more than 20 years. And in that time, he had developed a set of principles about construction that he regarded as settled questions. Stone belonged under a house. Wood belonged around it. The properties of each material were well understood by anyone who had spent enough time working with both of them, and anyone who proposed to arrange them differently was either ignorant of the evidence or choosing to ignore it. He said as much in measured and unhurried tones to the man working below him. Corbett Farnsworth, who owned the sawmill 2 miles down the creek road, approached the situation from the angle of a businessman watching a potential customer make a bad decision. He had good lumber sitting in his yard. He had prices Ransom could afford. He did the arithmetic out loud, estimating what a proper 2-room cabin with a tight roof and fitted windows would have cost compared to whatever Ransom was doing, and the comparison was not favorable to the stone. Virgil Pembroke waited for both men to finish before he spoke, which was also his habit, because he had learned that a remark lands better when the ground has been prepared. He looked at the low walls, the piles of rubble, the shallow mixing pit, the whole improbable enterprise. Then he looked at the 2 men beside him, made sure they were listening, and said what he had been composing since he had ridden into view. Thatcher's ice house. He let it settle for a moment. Sanford Holloway allowed the corners of his mouth to shift. Corbett Farnsworth made a sound that might have been a short laugh. Then they turned their horses back toward the road. Ransom had heard all of it. He finished pressing mortar into the joint he was working on, cleaned his trowel against the edge of the mixing pit, and stood. The afternoon sun was still resting on the southern wall. He walked to it, pressed his palm flat against the stone, and held it there for several seconds. Then he said to no one in particular, because the 3 men were already riding away, "This wall keeps yesterday alive." No one heard it. No one answered. Ransom picked up his trowel and went back to work. The nickname spread faster than he had expected. Within 2 weeks, Thatcher's Ice House had become the standard version of the story at the general store, and Virgil Pembroke had expanded it considerably in the retelling. In one version, the walls were slowly sinking. In another, Ransom planned to sleep underground like a prairie dog. The details changed with each telling, but the conclusion remained stable. A man was wasting the most important building season of the year on a pile of old rock, and come January, his family would discover the cost of that decision. Cordelia heard a version of it during a trip to buy flour. She heard it from the woman behind the counter, and from two women waiting ahead of her in line, and she heard it in the particular tone that people use when they believe they are being careful, but are not. She bought her flour, thanked the man behind the counter, and walked out into the afternoon. Supper that evening was quiet. Afterward, when Jasper and Hesta were asleep, Cordelia sat down at the table across from Ransom without any introduction to what she was about to say. She had spent the day carrying water and lifting stone and listening to people explain why the thing she was helping to build was going to fail. And she had not responded to any of it, and now she had one question that was not rhetorical. Will it be finished before the first hard freeze? Ransom looked at his hands for a moment. The lime had dried in the cracks across his knuckles, and several of them had opened and bled during the day and dried again. He looked at the unfinished northern wall through the window and then back at his hands. It has to be. Cordelia looked at him for a moment longer, then stood and began clearing the table. Neither of them said anything else. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, and between two people who understood each other. Honesty without comfort was sometimes the only thing available. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday in August without warning in the form of 2 days of cold rain. It was not a dramatic storm. There was no thunder worth remembering, and the wind was not extreme. It was simply rain, steady and indifferent. The kind of rain that finds the weaknesses in a building that its maker hoped no one would notice. It fell for 2 full days and saturated the ground around the fort's foundation on all sides. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ransom walked out to the northern wall and found what he had not expected to find. The lowest course of the recently repointed section had shifted outward. A section of fresh mortar near the base had been undermined by pooled water that had nowhere to drain. 3 stones along the bottom course had moved enough to open gaps that had not been there before. He stood in front of the damaged section for a long time without moving. Loam came to investigate. The dog lowered his nose to the wet earth at the base of the wall, sniffed along the displaced stones, and then turned and walked away to find a dry place to lie down. It was not a complicated assessment. Before noon, Virgil Pembroke rode past on the main trail and saw the damage from horseback. He did not stop. By evening, Ransom learned from Jasper, who had been in town on an errand, that the newest version of the story had already circulated at the general store. According to Pembroke's account, Thatcher's ice house was falling apart before the first snowflake had appeared. The following morning, Sanford Holloway arrived alone. He came without Farnsworth or Pembroke, which Ransom noticed immediately. He dismounted, tied his horse to a post, and walked to the damaged corner without speaking. He crouched down and studied the pooled water, the displaced stones, the angle of the ground. He took his time. When he finally stood, his face held the expression of a man delivering a verdict he had been asked to render. Water will do what cold finishes. He said it without pleasure or malice, which made it considerably harder to dismiss than if he had said it with either. Then he walked back to his horse and rode away, and Ransom was left standing in front of a section of wall that had just been assessed by the most credible observer in the basin and found to be deficient. That night after dark, after the family was asleep, Ransom sat outside on the ground, beside the pile of stones he had already removed from the damaged section. The air was cold and the creek was audible in the darkness, and the stars were out in their full September quantity. He sat there and tried to locate within himself the certainty that had brought him to this point. It was not as easy to find as it had been in June. The morning he had bought the deed to this land, the memory of the lime kiln had felt like evidence. Now he pressed his hand against one of the stones from the damaged section. The same stone that had been sitting in the Wyoming night air for several hours, and the stone was cold. Not the cool of an evening that would warm by afternoon. Cold in the way of something that had been emptied of whatever it once held. He sat with that for a long time. The question that came to him in the dark was not about drainage or mortar ratios or the angle of the ground. It was a simpler and more dangerous question. He had spent his family's savings on this land. There was nothing held back. If the walls did not perform the way his hands remembered from that morning beside the lime kiln 15 years ago, there was no lumber money, no alternative plan, no second attempt. The wooden cabin they had wintered in before was already occupied by the family who had bought it in the spring. What he was building here was not a plan. It was the only plan. He did not move for a long time. Then Cordelia came out. She did not ask what he was thinking. She did not offer reassurance or caution, or any of the things a person might say to someone sitting alone in the dark beside a failed wall. She simply stood beside him in the cold close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. After a while, without speaking, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and then sat down on the ground beside him. They sat there together in the dark for a few minutes. Then Ransom reached down, picked up one of the displaced stones and turned it over in his hands. He began working again before the sun was fully up the next morning. The repair was not simply a matter of replacing what had failed. Ransom understood that clearly enough now. He opened the trench around the northern foundation wider and deeper than before. The problem had been water with nowhere to go. He created somewhere for it to go. A bed of crushed shale filled the bottom of the new trench loose enough to carry water away from the base of the wall, covered with larger stones laid without mortar so the drainage could work. The grade of the ground along the northern face was corrected to move surface water away from the structure, rather than toward it. These were not small adjustments. They added 3 days to the work and erased most of what he had accomplished on that section over the previous 2 weeks. The mortar formula changed as well. More lime in the exterior mix, less clay near the surface, a harder outer shell that would resist rain and eventual ice. The inner layer retained more flexibility so it could bond properly with the irregular stone surfaces. These were decisions he had arrived at through failure, which is its own kind of instruction. On the second afternoon of the repair work, a young man appeared at the edge of the work area and stood watching without saying anything. He was 17 tall with his father's broad forehead and a quality of quiet attention that his father also possessed. Though in Sanford Holloway it had long since calcified into certainty, in Cable Holloway it was still open. He watched Ransom work for 15 minutes without speaking. Then he asked why Ransom had not used more lime in the exterior layer from the beginning. Ransom stopped. He looked at the boy for a moment. In 2 months of skepticism, mockery, and quiet avoidance, that was the first question anyone in the basin had asked him. That was about the work itself, rather than about his judgment in doing it. He answered it directly. He explained the two-layer approach, the exterior hardened against water and frost, the interior layer softer to maximize the bond between mortar and stone. Cable listened. He looked at the wall for a moment, then at the trench, then at the mixing pit. He nodded once with the manner of someone filing information, rather than rendering approval. Then he walked away without saying anything else. Ransom watched him go. He did not know what to make of it. He picked up his trowel and went back to work. The repaired section was complete 4 days later, when the mortar had set and the trench was backfilled and the surface drainage corrected. The rebuilt corner looked almost identical to the sections that had not failed. The difference was invisible to any casual observer. It was present in the depth of the drainage bed, in the ratio of the mortar and the angle of the ground. Loam came to investigate. The dog walked slowly along the new work nose, moving close to the surface, working his way from one end of the repaired section to the other. Then he circled once and lay down beside the wall. Ransom noticed. He did not say anything about it. Summer was nearly gone. The sod roof still had to go on. The loft floor had to be laid. The hearth had to be built. The entrance framing had to be fitted. And the 2 small windows seated in their deep reveals. There was work enough ahead to occupy every remaining hour of good weather. And the weather was already changing its quality in the mornings, the air carrying a new edge before the sun was fully up. From the road, the old stone fort still looked like nothing in particular. Low walls on a slight rise, a dog sleeping in the afternoon sun. A man working without visible progress through the long hours of a Wyoming summer. What the road could not show was the trench around the northern foundation, carefully filled and graded. It could not show the 2-layer mortar in the repaired corner, harder outside and softer within. It could not show the notebook that Ransom had started keeping, noting temperatures and firewood use against the cooling autumn nights. It could not show the conversation that had happened in the dark, or the hand on the shoulder, or the stone picked up and turned in the hands in the darkness. Winter was still months away, but it was no longer abstract. And somewhere in the valley, 3 men who had ridden past on a summer afternoon were going to find out when the coldest nights finally arrived, whether a wall could keep yesterday alive. The cottonwood beams went up on a Thursday in early October, and the men who watched from the road that afternoon did not say much. There was something about the sight of those heavy timbers laid across the top of the stone walls that changed the nature of the project in a way that mockery could not easily address. It was no longer a man moving old rocks around a field. It was becoming something with a roof. The beams were the heaviest work of the entire construction. Ransom and Jasper lifted each one together, working in silence, because the effort required all the breath they had. Cordelia steadied the ends from below while Ransom climbed to position them from above his boots, finding purchase on the rough stone, his hands moving the timber into its seat with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that a mistake at this stage would cost more than time. Hesta watched from a distance and did not ask questions, which meant she understood this was not the moment for them. The sagebrush lattice came next. Dried branches laid crosswise over the beams to create the base for what followed. Then prairie grass, thick bundles of it cut from the hillside and carried up in armloads pressed into the lattice until the gaps were filled. Then the sod. Each sod block had to be cut from the hillside with a flat spade lifted intact, carried to the rise, hoisted up, and fitted against its neighbors with enough care that the seams would close as the material settled. A block cut too thin would crack. One cut too thick would be too heavy to manage on the upper tier. Ransom had practiced the cut on a test section of hillside the week before and arrived at a depth that balanced weight against integrity. 14 inches. He cut every block himself until Jasper demonstrated he could hold the dimension consistently, and then they worked together. It took 11 days. When the last section of sod was fitted and tamped, and the edges pressed down against the tops of the stone walls, Cordelia stepped back from the structure and looked at what they had built. The roof blended into the hillside behind it with an ease that was almost unsettling. The building did not look constructed. It looked like something the earth had decided to push slightly above its surface. The two small windows set deep in the thick walls stared out across the basin like narrow eyes that had been watching the valley for a long time and had formed their own conclusions. "It looks buried," Cordelia said. Ransom rested his hand against the southern wall. "That is why it may live." He said it without drama, the way a man states a thing he has considered long enough that it no longer feels like a claim. Cordelia looked at the building for another moment, then turned back toward the work that remained. The hearth was the last major element and the one Ransom had thought about longest. He did not build it as a freestanding structure in the center of the room the way most settlers positioned their iron stoves. He built it directly against the northern wall, setting the firebox into the masonry itself, so that every fire lit inside it would feed heat into the stone, as well as into the air of the room. He laid the hearthstone and the surround from the same dense gray rock that formed the walls, fitting the pieces without mortar between them at the firebox level, so the expansion and contraction of repeated heating would not crack the work apart over time. On the first evening, he lit a fire in the new hearth. He did not check the thermometer immediately. He let the fire burn for an hour, then pressed his open palm against the interior face of the northern wall above the firebox. The stone was warm to the depth of his hand. He held the position for a long moment, nodded once to himself, and went to find the notebook. The general store in Elkhorn Basin was a building that served more social functions than its name suggested. Men gathered there in the mornings to exchange information, and in the evenings to process it, and the information that moved through it shaped opinion in the basin more reliably than anything printed and posted. By the time the sod roof was finished, and the Crane family had moved their belongings from the temporary shelter they had occupied during construction into the stone house on the rise, the story being told at the general store had shifted in tone, if not in conclusion. The mockery was still present. Virgil Pembroke was still its primary craftsman, but the laughter that followed his contributions had changed quality. It was thinner. Some of the men who had laughed freely in July were waiting to see what January had to say before they committed further. Sanford Holloway noticed this. He was a man who paid attention to the opinions of other builders, not because he was uncertain of his own, but because the collective judgment of experienced men was itself a form of evidence, and evidence was what Holloway respected above everything else. He had not changed his assessment of the stone house. He simply knew with the precision of a craftsman who has worked long enough to understand the difference between principle and outcome, that his assessment would be tested by the winter, and that winter was the only judge whose opinion he could not argue with. He said as much at the general store on a Wednesday in October, when the conversation had circled back to Thatcher's ice house for what felt like the fourth time that week. He said it in front of Ransom Thatcher, who had come in to buy lamp oil and was standing at the counter when Holloway spoke. "I want to know something specific," Holloway said. He was addressing the room but looking at Ransom. "If the fire goes out at midnight, how warm is that house at first light?" The room quieted. It was the kind of question that could not be deflected with a joke, because it had a specific answer that January would eventually provide. Ransom set his lamp oil on the counter and looked at Holloway directly. "Warm enough that I will not need to relight it the moment I wake up." Holloway received this without expression. He looked at the counter for a moment, then back at Ransom. "I will check that in January," he said. Not as a threat, as a statement of intention from a man who intended to be accurate about things. The room stayed quiet for a beat after they both looked away. Corbett Farnsworth shifted his weight. Someone near the door cleared his throat. The conversation moved on to other topics, but what had just happened did not dissolve with it. Holloway had put his credibility on the record. If the stone house failed in January, he would be the one to say so publicly. And everyone in the room understood that his saying so would carry weight that nothing Pembroke invented could match. Ransom picked up his lamp oil and left without elaborating. That night he opened the notebook to a fresh page. He mounted the second thermometer on the wall near the northern hearth and noted the date and the starting temperatures for both instruments. Outside the window, the first truly cold air of the season had arrived from the north, dropping the temperature to 18 degrees by the time the family went to sleep. He woke at 4 in the morning and checked the thermometers by lamplight without waking anyone. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 9 degrees. Near the front door, the interior thermometer read 46. Near the northern wall, where the hearth had been burning since early evening, it read 51. The fire had been reduced to coals before midnight. He recorded both numbers with the care of a man who understood that these pages were not a diary. They were evidence accumulating one entry at a time for a court that had not yet convened. Seraphina Fairchild came to the door on a morning in early November without announcement, as was her habit with the short walk between her property and the Thatcher place. She was 55 years old and had lived alone since her husband Arden had died of winter pneumonia 3 years before. Arden Strom had been a man of strong opinions about construction, most of which the other settlers in the basin had found eccentric. He had believed that earth and stone managed cold better than timber, and that the settlers around him were building their houses wrong. Seraphina had not agreed with him when he was alive. She had not disagreed with him either, which was a different thing and one she thought about more than she let on. She stood in the doorway of the stone house and looked at the interior for a long moment before speaking. Then she asked whether the walls were damp. Ransom invited her in. He walked her to the interior face of the southern wall and waited while she pressed her hand against the stone. She stood there, with her eyes unfocused, as if she were listening to something rather than feeling it. After a while, she said quietly, and without looking at him, that Arden had told her earth and stone held warmth better than wood. She said she had not believed him. She said it as a statement of fact, without particular regret in her voice, though Cordelia, who was standing near the table and heard all of it, thought there was something in the flatness of the statement That was the sound a person makes when regret has been lived with long enough to reach a kind of equilibrium. Serafina took her hand off the wall and walked back to the door. Ransom did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Jasper found his father in the notebook one evening in mid-November, sitting at the table after supper, with the pages open and the lamp burning. The boy had been quiet since returning from town that afternoon, and Cordelia had told Ransom the reason while Jasper was outside splitting kindling. A group of boys his age had spent the better part of an hour asking Jasper about his family's house in terms that were not sympathetic. The questions had been creative in the way that adolescent cruelty tends toward creativity, and they had centered on the question of whether the Crane family planned to freeze together in their stone hole or separately. Jasper had not answered them. He had come home and split enough kindling to last a week. Ransom waited until after supper to address it, which was another decision Cordelia understood before he made it. He did not sit Jasper down for a conversation. He took the boy to the northern wall after the fire had been burning for 3 hours and told him to put his hand on the stone. Jasper put his hand on the stone. He stood there in silence for a moment, then a moment longer. His expression changed in the way of someone who has just been told something they did not know how to ask. "What do you feel?" Ransom asked. Jasper kept his hand on the stone. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "It is warm." "That is the only answer your father has," Ransom said. "The wall does not care what anyone thinks about it." Jasper stood there for another few seconds, his hand on the stone, looking at the wall rather than at his father. Then he went to bed without saying anything else. He did not mention the boys from town again. December arrived the way a verdict arrives without announcing itself until it was already present. The first indication was a temperature reading at the postal station north of the basin, passed along by a rider coming south on the main trail. 34 below zero at the station, and dropping. By the following morning, the number had reached 38 below, and the rider who brought it said the sky to the north had the quality of sky that precedes conditions worse than what had already arrived. That was all anyone needed to hear. The jokes about Thatcher's ice house did not circulate at the general store that week. Nobody was in the mood for jokes of any kind. The arithmetic of survival had reasserted itself with the authority it always carried in Wyoming in December. And beside that arithmetic, the question of whether a stone house was foolish or clever became briefly irrelevant. What the cold announced when it arrived was its indifference. It came from the north with the accumulated force of the open plains behind it, and it did not negotiate. Fence lines disappeared under drifts that formed overnight where nothing had been before. Cottonwood trees cracked in the darkness with sounds that brought people to their windows, holding lanterns, certain for a moment that something had broken, or someone had fired a gun. Cattle turned their backs to the wind and stood motionless for hours, frost building around their eyes and muzzles, until they looked like sculptures of themselves. At the postal station north of the basin, the thermometer sank to 38 below and kept moving. In cabin after cabin across the valley, the familiar emergency began. Stoves that had been adequate in November became inadequate in December. Firewood that had seemed like enough in October was visibly becoming not enough by the end of the first week. Men who had built carefully and well, men like Sanford Holloway who understood joinery and roof lines and the direction of prevailing winds, found themselves waking at 2 a.m. to feed their fires, then waking again at 4, their sleep reduced to intervals measured between trips to the woodpile. Holloway lay awake one night in the middle of the first serious cold, listening to the wind work against his cabin walls. And he thought about the entry he had made in the ledger of his own opinions 8 months ago. He thought about the public statement he had made at the general store. He thought about the number of times he had watched a skilled craftsman get something wrong, and the number of times that craftsman had been himself. He did not resolve anything in that thinking, but he lay awake with it for longer than he intended to. On the rise above Windell Creek, the stone house ran by a different clock. There was a fire in the hearth, but it was not a desperate fire. It was modest burning at the pace of a fire that does not need to compensate for walls that are losing heat faster than it can be replaced. The coals built up over the evening and were banked before the family slept, and the stone around the firebox absorbed what the fire gave before the warmth could escape up the chimney or through the walls to the night outside. Cordelia sat in the far corner of the room mending a shirt by lamplight. She had not moved her chair closer to the hearth all evening. Jasper read at the table with his coat on the hook by the door rather than on his back. Hesta slept under a single blanket, without her coat, her breathing the slow and even breathing of someone who is warm enough not to need to protect themselves even in sleep. Loam lay on the packed earth floor of the room with his chin on his paws, several feet from the hearth close to the southern wall, where the stone had been collecting afternoon sun and evening firelight for 2 months. His breathing was slow. He was not searching for warmth. He had found it where he had always known it would be. Ransom checked the thermometers at 3 in the morning without lighting the lamp, using the faint light from the banked coals. The fire had been down to coals since before midnight. Outside, the temperature had reached 36 below zero. The thermometer near the front door read 49 degrees. The one near the northern wall read 53. He found the notebook in the dark by feel and wrote both numbers by the light of a single match held at arm's length so it would not wake anyone. He closed the notebook and went back to sleep. The morning of the third day, Cordelia checked the water bucket that sat near the outer wall, away from the immediate influence of the hearth. She lifted it by the handle and looked at the surface, still liquid. She set it down. She looked at the stack of firewood beside the wall, counting the remaining logs. Against the number of days, the cold showed no sign of releasing. She picked up a log she had planned to burn that night and placed it back on the pile. Ransom watched the gesture from across the room. Cordelia did not look at him. She turned and went back to what she had been doing before. The gesture had lasted 3 seconds. It told him more than a conversation would have. On the afternoon of the third day, a knock came at the door that Ransom was not expecting. Deputy Elwood Treadwell was 38 years old and had the kind of face that had spent a long time outdoors, arriving at its current arrangement. He was covered in snow from his collar to his boots, and his expression held the particular quality of a man who has ridden through something difficult and arrived with information that requires immediate attention. He told Ransom that Seraphina Fairchild had burned through her entire woodpile sometime before noon. Her stove had been cold for 4 hours. Treadwell had tried to carry additional firewood to her from the nearest available source, but the drifting between her property and the road had reached the point where a horse could not manage the crossing with a load. He had been able to get himself through on foot, but not with enough wood to be useful. He had come to the Thatcher place because it was the closest structure that showed signs of being warm enough to matter. He said Seraphina had told him she did not want to impose. She had made him promise to ask first. Ransom had his coat on before Treadwell finished the sentence. Treadwell said it was not necessary for Ransom to come personally. Ransom looked at him. She asked. Ransom said, "That is enough." They went out into the storm together. The crossing took 40 minutes for a distance that would have taken 8 in clear weather. The drifts between the two properties had achieved a consistency somewhere between snow and architecture, with faces that the wind had smoothed to a hard finish and interiors that gave unpredictably underfoot. Ransom broke trail and Treadwell followed, and neither of them spoke because the wind made conversation impractical, and because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already communicated. Seraphina Fairchild was sitting in her coat in the center of her house when they arrived. The stove was cold. The temperature inside was not far above what the temperature outside would have been, without walls at all. She had placed her hands inside her coat sleeves and was sitting very straight in her chair, with the particular stillness of a person who has decided not to give the cold the satisfaction of watching them move. She looked at Ransom when he came in and said nothing. He looked at her for a moment, assessed what he saw, and then said they were going. She did not argue. The walk back was slower, with 3 people, Seraphina, between the 2 men, her feet finding the footing that Ransom's path had broken in the drifts. They did not hurry because hurrying was not possible, and because a fall in those conditions was a problem of a different order than slowness. The wind was directly against them for the last 200 yards, and Ransom put himself on the windward side of Seraphina and kept moving. When they came through the door of the stone house, the difference was immediate in a way that required no description. It was present in the air, in the stillness of it, in the absence of the penetrating cold that had been working its way into them for the past 40 minutes. Cordelia had the fire built up and a blanket ready before Seraphina had fully crossed the threshold. Seraphina sat near the hearth and did not speak for a long time. Cordelia brought broth and sat with her while Treadwell warmed himself by the fire, and Ransom hung his wet coat by the door. The color came back into Seraphina's face gradually, the way warmth returns to something that has been cold enough, for long enough that the return is measured in small increments. After an hour, Seraphina looked around the room in the way of someone seeing a place clearly for the first time after seeing it only partially before. She looked at the walls. She looked at the ceiling where the sod above the beams held the cold outside with the indifference of 12 inches of earth. She looked at Loam sleeping near the southern wall well away from the fire, comfortable in a room that was warm without being heated to the temperature of a furnace. She put her hand on the wall beside her chair. The stone was warm, not the sharp, aggressive warmth of something close to a fire, but the steady, diffuse warmth of something that had been absorbing heat for 2 months and was now giving it back without effort or announcement. Cordelia, sitting beside her, saw the tears before Seraphina made any sound. They came without warning and without theater, just water moving down a face that had been held still for a long time. Cordelia did not say anything. She set down the bowl she was holding and sat closer. Seraphina said very quietly that Arden had been right. Nobody in the room asked her to clarify. Nobody needed to. Outside, the wind continued. The temperature at the postal station was still dropping. Somewhere across the valley, in well-built wooden cabins with tight joinery and carefully fitted windows, men were waking in the night to feed fires that could not hold what they were given. And in a stone house on a rise above Windle Creek, a woman who had spent 3 years deciding whether her dead husband had understood something she had missed was sitting with her hand on a warm wall, having arrived at her answer. in the middle of the worst storm anyone in Elkhorn Basin could remember. The fourth night came down hard and full, and Ransom sat alone after the others slept with the notebook open on his knee. He did not write anything for a long time. He looked at the numbers he had already recorded, and at the sound of the wind against the sod above him, which was not the sound of wind through walls, but the sound of wind against a mast that declined to participate in the emergency. He remembered what Holloway had said at the general store. "I will check that in January." The storm was not January. The storm was December, and it was still going. Somewhere out in it on the fifth morning, a horse would break a fence and run, and the man who came looking for it would put his hand against a wall he had spent 8 months dismissing in the dark and the cold alone with no one watching, and discover something he had not been prepared to discover. That morning had not arrived yet, but it was one night away. The horse came back without its rider at first light on the fifth morning of the storm. Sanford Holloway saw it from the window of his cabin before the lamp on his table had fully warmed. The animal was standing at the paddock gate with snow packed deep into its mane and the reins trailing in the drift below its chest. The far section of fence was down. He could see the break from where he stood, a gap where 2 posts had given way under the weight of 4 days of accumulation, and the gap was wide enough that a horse with any intention of leaving would have found it without difficulty. He did not spend time deliberating. He dressed in everything available to him that could be worn at once, and went out into the storm without a full accounting of what the conditions were going to ask of him. The tracks the missing horse had left were already compromised by the overnight wind. Holloway followed what remained of them because following was the only option, and the trail moved south and east across open ground toward Windell Creek, through the kind of terrain that does not offer shelter or landmarks when visibility drops below 100 yards. He had been building in this basin for more than 20 years, and he understood its geography with precision. But geography understood from the inside of a warm structure, and geography understood on foot in a blizzard at 36 below zero are different subjects entirely. He found this out in stages over the following hour. The cold at that temperature did not announce itself through discomfort alone. It worked methodically through the layers of his clothing, not urgently, but with the patience of something that has unlimited time and does not need to hurry. His right hand inside its glove began to lose the fine calibration that a craftsman's hand depends on. He could still close his fingers, but the information they returned to him had become approximate in a way that made him aware for the first time in the crossing that the margin between manageable and unmanageable was narrower than he had walked out of his house believing. The trail curved around a long drift and brought him to the rise above the creek. He almost missed the structure entirely. The stone house sat so low against the hill behind it, its sod roof continuous with the frozen slope, that the eye found no reason to stop on it. No sharp angles, no vertical lines breaking the white, just a shape that the land seemed to have produced of its own accord, with 2 narrow windows set into it at regular intervals. He stopped when he recognized the geometry. He had been moving for close to an hour, and his hands were beyond the state of mere coldness, and his thinking had acquired a quality of flatness that he recognized as a warning. He took 1 step toward the building, and a gust came from the northwest. Not the sustained wind, but a distinct event, a concentrated force that struck him on the left side and moved him 2 full steps before he recovered his footing. His right hand went out and found the southern wall. He stood with his bare right hand flat against the stone and did not move. He was a man who had worked with his hands for 30 years, and those hands had developed a precision of sensation that went beyond ordinary feeling. He had held pieces of wood and known from the texture of the grain which direction it would split under a chisel. He had run his fingers along a joint and known whether the fit was adequate or merely close. His hands were instruments calibrated by decades of use, and what the right hand was telling him now did not match anything in the catalog of what stone was supposed to feel like in conditions of 36 below zero. The cold was present. He was not confusing warmth for its absence, but the specific quality of the cold was wrong. Stone at this temperature should have drawn heat from his skin immediately and aggressively, the way metal does, the way any dense conductive material does when the temperature differential is large enough. What he felt instead was a resistance to that transfer. Something held inside the stone was pushing back against the loss, not powerfully, not dramatically, but unmistakably the way a debt long forgotten pushes back when it is finally called in. He stood with his hand on that wall for what he later calculated was close to 2 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that in the way that significant moments tend to resist accurate timing. He was thinking about the morning in October when he had crouched beside Ransom Thatcher's drainage trench and said that water does what cold finishes. He had said it as a man delivering a judgment he was confident in, and he had been confident in it because it was true. Water does what cold finishes. He had been right about that. He had also, he was now understanding, been right about a much smaller portion of the complete question than he had presented himself as being right about. He walked to the door and knocked. Ransom opened it. He was dressed and awake, which meant he had been up for some time already, and his expression when he saw Holloway was the expression of a man who registers a fact and files it without comment. No surprise visible, no satisfaction. He stepped back from the door and Holloway came in. The interior of the stone house in the early morning of the 5th day of the worst cold in recent memory was not a spectacular thing to witness. It was not dramatic. There was no roaring fire, no furnace heat, no visible evidence of extraordinary effort. There was a modest fire in the hearth that had clearly been burning for some time. The air in the room was still, with no drafts moving along the floor and no cold pockets waiting in the corners. Seraphina Fairchild was asleep near the southern wall, with a blanket over her and Loam lying close to her feet. Jasper was asleep in the loft. Hester was asleep in the corner bed. Cordelia was at the table with a cup in her hands, awake, watching Holloway with the careful attention of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a moment to arrive and intends to see it clearly. Holloway looked at the room the way he looked at a building he had been hired to assess, methodically from one element to the next. He looked at the walls, at the ceiling where the sod pressed down solid and unmoving above the beams. He looked at Seraphina Fairchild, sleeping in apparent comfort several feet from the fire. He looked at the woodpile. The woodpile was the thing that stopped him for the longest moment. After 5 full days and nights of temperatures that had driven every other family in the basin to the edge of their fuel reserves or beyond the woodpile, retained a volume that no wooden structure of equivalent size could have managed on those conditions. He knew this with the precision of a man who had spent 3 decades calculating the fuel requirements of buildings in this climate. The numbers in front of him did not match his calculations. They matched something else entirely. He cleared his throat. Ransom was standing near the table, not offering anything, not explaining anything, waiting with the patience of a man who has stopped needing to make his case. "How much wood?" Holloway said. Ransom walked to the shelf, picked up the notebook, and handed it to Holloway without speaking. Holloway read. He stood in the middle of the room with his coat still on and the snow still melting from his boots. And he read every entry in the notebook from the first night of October through the previous evening. He read the temperatures, both exterior and interior, for each of the 5 nights of the storm. He read the wood consumption figures. He read the times at which fires had been banked and the interior temperatures recorded in the hours after banking. He read the entries about the water bucket. He read at the bottom of several entries a single notation that read PSW, which he understood after a moment to mean Loam South Wall. He read it all the way through without stopping, and when he finished, he went back and read 3 of the entries a second time. Then he lowered the notebook. He looked at the cover for a moment with the expression of a man who has just finished reading a document that requires him to revise something important and is taking the time to understand exactly what revision is required before he speaks. He set the notebook on the table with the same care Ransom had set it down in October, the care given to things that contain accurate information and therefore deserve to be handled without carelessness. He opened his mouth, then he closed it. He looked at the fire, then the door opened again. Cable Holloway came through it with the snow of a 1-hour walk through the storm packed into every layer of his clothing. He was 17 years old, and he had left the house when he saw his father's horse return without its rider, and he had followed the same trail his father had followed across the open ground, in the same conditions his father had walked through, because the alternative was to stay home and not know. He stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his face red with the cold, looking at his father standing in the middle of the room with a notebook in his hands. Then he looked at the room itself, at the walls, at the temperature that was immediately and unmistakably different from the temperature outside the door he was still holding open. "Close the door," Cordelia said. He closed it. Sanford Holloway looked at his son. He looked at the melting snow on the boy's shoulders, the height of the drifts recorded in how high the snow reached on his clothing, the evidence of how far he had come, and in what conditions. He looked at Ransom Thatcher. He looked back at his son. Cable looked at Ransom with the expression he had worn on the afternoon he came to ask about lime ratios. The question in it was the same question, but larger, now expanded by everything the storm had added to it. Cordelia brought a blanket and put it around Cable without being asked. She handed him a cup of something warm and steered him toward the hearth with the efficiency of a woman who has had enough of watching men stand in doorways processing information when there are practical matters to attend to. Holloway watched his son sit down near the fire. He watched the boy's hands wrap around the cup. He watched the color in the boy's face begin its slow return from the colors of the storm to the colors of someone who is gonna be all right. And he watched Ransom Thatcher watching the same thing with an expression that held something Holloway recognized because he had felt it himself standing at windows when his children were outside in weather that required watching. It was the expression of a man who understands what it costs to come looking for someone you are afraid for. Cable looked up at his father from the chair. Then he looked at Ransom. The question that had been in his face since August, the question about lime ratios that had really been a question about something larger, was still there. But it had changed shape. It was not the question of a boy trying to understand a technique. It was the question of someone who has walked an hour through a blizzard and arrived somewhere warm, and is beginning to understand that the warmth has a specific history, and that the history is worth knowing. Holloway looked at his son in the chair. He looked at Ransom standing near the table. He thought about the things he had taught Cable in 17 years, and about the things he had not taught him, and about the particular gap that had opened between those two categories in the last several months. He said, "My son wants to learn what you know about building with stone. I am asking you to teach him." He said it simply without preamble or qualification, and the simplicity of it cost him something that anyone paying attention could have measured. Ransom looked at Cabell. The boy met his eyes. Ransom said, "Come in the spring when the ground is workable. We will start with the foundation." Cabell nodded. It was the nod of someone accepting a serious offer with the seriousness it deserves. Holloway said nothing more. He had said the thing he came to say, which was not the thing he had come looking for when he followed a horse's tracks into the storm, but which was, he understood now, the more important errand of the two. The storm released its hold over the following 2 days, the wind declining in stages, the temperature rising towards zero, and then above it with the grudging reluctance of something that had not intended to let go. People came out of their buildings and looked at what December had done and began the accounting. The accounting was not cheerful. 3 families in the northern part of the basin had burned furniture in the final days of the storm when their wood ran out. 2 men had suffered frostbite during livestock rescues. A section of Corbett Farnsworth's lumber shed had collapsed under drift weight and taken several thousand board feet of seasoned pine with it. Virgil Pembroke had lost a cow. The basin had survived the storm the way frontier communities survive things, not without damage, but without catastrophic loss, and with the knowledge that next time the preparation would be different. The conversation at the general store in the days after the storm had a different character than the conversations that had preceded it. People were not yet celebrating or congratulating anyone. They were still in the mode of assessment that follows a serious test. But the assessment included the stone house on the rise above Windle Creek in a way that the conversations of last summer had not. Virgil Pembroke made an attempt at the old rhythm on the 4th day after the storm ended. He was standing near the stove at the general store with his coat open, warming himself with the comfort of a man who had survived something and intended to discuss it in the most advantageous terms available. He said with the grin that had served him well through the summer that he supposed Thatcher's ice house had not frozen solid after all. He got a polite sound from 2 men near the counter, not the laughter of July, the kind of sound men make when they are acknowledging that something was said and declining to endorse it. The door opened and Sanford Holloway came in. He came in the way he always came in, without announcement, with the manner of a man who has decided where he is going and is in the process of arriving there. His coat was wet from the walk and his boots left tracks across the floor. He looked at Pembroke with a brief and neutral attention that Pembroke received and understood, because Pembroke was perceptive in the way that men who deal in social currency tend to be perceptive. Holloway looked at the room. He said anyone planning to build on the north side of the basin next year ought to visit Ransom Thatcher before they place a lumber order. The room absorbed this. Corbett Farnsworth, who was standing near the far wall with his arms folded, said, "You are saying stone is better than pine." Holloway looked toward the window. Outside, the valley was still mostly white, the drifts softening now in the weak December sun, but still present everywhere, still recording in their contours the direction and force of what had moved through. He looked at the evidence of the storm laid out across the landscape, and then He looked back at the room. He said, "I am saying the cold does not care what I used to believe." Nobody laughed. The statement landed in the room with the particular weight of a thing said by someone who has paid for the right to say it, in the currency of a changed opinion that everyone present understood had cost him something to change. Corbett Farnsworth looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Holloway. Then he unfolded his arms. He said nothing, which from Farnsworth was its own form of concession. Virgil Pembroke looked at his boots. The conversation moved on to other things, as conversations do. But the direction it had been moving in before Holloway came through the door was not the direction it moved in after. And everyone in the room knew which man had changed it, and why his changing it mattered. Ransom was not present. He had not been in town since before the storm began. Spring came to Elkhorn Basin the way it always came, slowly. And from the south, the snow retreating from the faces of hills that caught the afternoon sun, while the north-facing slopes held their white for weeks longer. Mud replaced the drifts on the main road. Wagon wheels cut fresh tracks. The birds that had been absent since October began to return in the order they always returned, which was the same order every year, and which the old-timers used to gauge where the season stood. People talked about that winter more than they talked about most winters, not because it had been the worst on record, but because it had settled something. The argument that had been running since the previous summer had received a verdict, and in a community where arguments tended to run indefinitely, because most of them could never be resolved by evidence, a verdict was worth discussing. Several settlers that spring began reinforcing the northern walls of their existing structures with fieldstone gathered from the hillsides. Others built low stone barriers around their hearths to capture and hold the heat that had previously gone directly up the chimney or out through the framing. A handful of the men building new houses that spring came to stand on the rise and look at the stone house from the outside, then asked to come inside and look at it from within, and Ransom showed them what there was to see, without theatrical presentation. The walls, the hearth placement, the drainage around the foundation, the depth of the sod. They looked at what he showed them, and they asked practical questions, and he gave practical answers. Sanford Holloway did not choose between stone and timber. He was too careful a craftsman for that kind of absolute position, and he had learned something in December about the cost of absolute positions. What he did instead was begin teaching anyone who would listen how the two materials could work together in a single structure, each one doing what it did best. The timber framing he had always known, the stone thermal mass that Ransom had demonstrated. The combination produced buildings that were better than either material alone, and Holloway knew it, and he taught it with the same precision he brought to everything he built. He began that teaching on a morning in late March when he and Cable came to the stone house together. Holloway introduced the visit simply his son wanted to learn from Ransom, and he had brought him. Cabell stood a few feet behind his father, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular door to open, and is now watching it open and is not sure yet whether to walk through or to stand a moment longer and understand the full dimension of what is being offered. Ransom looked at Cable for a moment, the boy who had stood at the edge of the work site in August asking about lime ratios, the boy who had walked an hour through the worst storm of the year to find his father. He looked at Holloway, the man who had told him stone would fail, and had then stood in the general store and told the basin that the cold did not care what he used to believe. He said to Cable, "Come and I will show you the northern wall first." Holloway stayed outside. He sat on the low stone border of the foundation and looked out across the basin in the thin spring sunlight. He did not go inside. This was not his lesson to receive. It was his son's, and delivering his son to the right teacher was the thing he had it in his power to do. And he had done it. Jasper watched Cable Holloway follow his father inside the stone house and then looked at his own father's back moving through the doorway, and something settled in him that had been unsettled since the summer before. He did not have words for it yet, but he felt it. The knowledge moved through the basin the way such things move through small communities, not through formal instruction or written record, but through the proximity of people who know something, to people who need to know it. One man showed another how to cut a drainage trench with the right grade. A builder pointed to a wall face and explained what the afternoon sun did to stone at that angle over the course of a full day. A father took his son to see a hearth that was built into a wall rather than away from it, and let the son put his hand on the stone and arrive at his own conclusion. After 2 more winters, the pattern was clear enough to discuss without argument. Families using stone features in their construction burned less wood, in some cases considerably less. The numbers varied with the size and design of each structure, but the direction of the numbers did not vary. People noticed. People who notice things in climates where noticing things is connected directly to staying alive tend to act on what they notice. They called it the Thatcher Wall. There were no plans, no publication, no formal recognition of any kind. It was simply what people called the technique when they referred to it, and they referred to it often enough that the name stuck and traveled and arrived eventually in communities beyond Elkhorn Basin that had never heard of Ransom Thatcher and would never meet him. The name went without the man. The knowledge went without either. One morning near the end of April, Jasper came to his father and said he wanted to help rebuild the northern wall of Seraphina Fairchild's house before the next winter. He said it the way a 14-year-old boy says a thing he has decided on not as a request, but as an announcement, with the slight uncertainty around the edges. That indicates the announcement is offered for approval, while simultaneously making clear that the decision behind it has already been made. Ransom looked at his son for a moment. Jasper had his mother's way of stating things plainly when he had made up his mind. He had also, Ransom noted, arrived at this decision without being asked or prompted. He had arrived at it on his own from whatever combination of observation and conscience and developing character had produced it. Ransom said, "Good. We will start when the ground dries enough to work the drainage properly." Jasper nodded and went back to what he had been doing. There was no further discussion because none was needed. A week later, Cordelia found Ransom at the table one evening after supper and sat across from him without speaking for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her work dress and placed a piece of paper on the table between them. It was folded, twice worn at the creases from having been folded and unfolded and carried for some time. He looked at it but did not pick it up. She nodded once, and he unfolded it and read what was written there. Seraphina Fairchild had written it in a hand that was careful and somewhat formal. The hand of someone who had learned to write in a school that valued precision and had not written a great many personal letters since. She had written that her husband's name was Arden. She had written that Arden had been right about stone and earth and the way people built their houses in this country. She had written that she had not told him so when he was alive and that she regretted this, and that, sitting in the stone house on the night of the 5th day of the storm with her hand on a warm wall, She had understood finally what he had been trying to tell her, and that she was grateful to Ransom and Cordelia for giving her the chance to understand it. She had written at the bottom, "I do not know if it is possible to tell a person something they needed to hear after they are gone. But I think perhaps you can do it by living the way they believed was right. I hope that is true." Ransom read it twice. He folded it back along its creases with the same care he would have given to the notebook, the same care given to things that contain accurate information and deserve handling without carelessness. He set it on the table. He did not speak for a long time. Cordelia sat across from him and let the silence hold what needed to be held without trying to fill it with something easier. After a while, he looked up at her. She was watching him with the attention she brought to things that mattered, which was the complete and unhurried attention of a woman who had learned early that the things worth watching were worth watching fully. He said she understood it in time. Cordelia said yes. Outside, Loam was in his place near the southern wall when Ransom came out that evening to sit for a while before the full dark arrived. The dog lifted his head when Ransom came out, registered that it was not a situation requiring further response, and put his chin back on his paws. Ransom sat on the low stone border and looked at the valley in the last light. The basin was green with the beginning of spring, the creek running full with snowmelt, the hillsides showing the first color of the year. In the places where the sun reached longest, somewhere below in the town, in the sawmill in the fields, people were making the decisions that would carry them through the coming year. Some of those decisions would be better than they would have been a year ago. That was how things moved, not in sudden revolutions, but in the gradual accumulation of evidence until the weight of it finally shifted something. Cordelia came out with 2 cups and sat beside him. She did not look at the valley or the light. She looked at Loam sleeping in his chosen place. She said, "Jasper wants to start at Seraphina's place as soon as you say the ground is ready." Ransom said, "Tell him next week if the drainage by the north face dries out the way it should." Cordelia held her cup for a moment. Then she said, "Arden Strom spent years trying to tell someone what you spent years trying to build. He did not get to see it either." Ransom looked at his cup. He thought about the lime kiln in the dark before sunrise, the hand against the wall, the warmth that should not have been there, and was. He thought about all the distance between that morning and this one. He said some things take the time they take. Cordelia set her cup down and took his hand. She did not say anything else. The evening completed itself around them in the way evenings do when the people in them have come far enough together that silence is not a problem, but a form of the same language as everything else they have said. The stone wall beside them held the warmth of the afternoon and would hold it through the night, giving it back slowly and without any interest in being noticed for the giving. That was the nature of the material. That was what it had always done in lime kilns and retaining walls and hearthstones, and the crumbling remains of a frontier fort that a man had seen differently from everyone else who had ever ridden past it. The cold does not care what a man used to believe, but the stone remembers what it was given. It remembers faithfully, completely, and without complaint, and it returns that warmth at the hour when the returning matters most. That had been true before Ransom Thatcher built his house on the rise above Windle Creek. It would be true after the house was gone. What he had done was find it, trust it, and hold on long enough for the winter to confirm it. The rest came from that. From a man who pressed his hand against a wall before sunrise and asked a question that took 15 years to answer properly. The answer was still here, still warm, still quietly present in the stone beside him. As the last of the April light left the valley and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridge, and the night came on gentle and cold and entirely manageable,